All right, Facebook land. Here we are in the middle of some serious boredom for everyone, and some serious stress. So I'm joining the legion of people who are basically live streaming their warm-ups. I've done a little bit of this before. I don't think I'm going to do a whole lot of commentary. I'm sure if I see anything pop up, I will, respond to it. But just a little bit, get us going in the middle of the day. Normally a warm-up would happen a little bit earlier, but during these times, who knows? So I think the best thing we can do is just try to keep going during these times when we're really stuck in. Try to just sort of focus in on our basics and just try to keep our wits about us and try to stay a little bit sane. So generally speaking, when I warm up, I've got this forest of trombones over here, among others, to work with. My strategy during this time when we're off from the orchestra is going to be to just try to maintain the best as I can to the various instruments that I have to play, and to, just maintain an overall level of trombone fitness. A lot of times when I start up, I do a little bit of this lips, mouthpiece, horn, Caruso stuff. For me, that's one of the best ways to just sort of check in every day. I do it pretty much as a matter of religion, to get started this way. So I usually, because I don't have perfect pitch, get started by just finding my middle F. And when I do this lips, mouthpiece, horn exercise, I'm basically just trying to get a good sense for where, it's like kind of like focusing in on where the aperture is. I like to know sort of a general idea where this starts, and then as I go from the lips to the mouthpiece and then to the horn itself, it helps me to sort of zero in and always aim for my best buzz. So. And this is basically a pitch bend that's going to descend chromatically. If you were hearing it on the instrument itself, it'd be going. And another little helpful tool here that I have oftentimes on my stand during this is the mirror. I broke it. Maybe it's my fault that we have all this disruption. 7 years of bad luck. Hopefully it's getting started now. But I will have that there just to sort of check in, make sure I've got my corners are where I want them to be, that I'm not letting any weird things happen even as I take a breath. It's possible sometimes when we breathe to develop bad habits of pulling up a corner here or there. Little things will sort of creep in, and during this time when we're all sort of a little stir crazy, stress manifests in a lot of different ways. I think it's just a good idea to make sure that you're taking care of those very basic embouchure mechanics. So I got the mirror set up right next to the stand here, and I'll just sort of watch and observe as I go through this. All right, so. Etc. Going down one octave. All right, let's say hypothetically I've gone all the way down to low F. I'll go right over from there to the mouthpiece. I'm trying to do the same thing. For those of you who are really going through embouchure stuff right now, or just curious about what your embouchure is doing, there is an additional step that I used when I was recovering from my injury years ago, and still occasionally use. It's called blocked buzzing, and the idea is you're basically going to form an embouchure, block off the mouthpiece, put some air pressure behind it. Imagine that you're playing the notes that you are about to play. Obviously no buzz will happen, but you're going to get the back pressure and everything from the mouthpiece. And what's really interesting to me, and I've done this with not only myself, but with some of my students who have gone through embouchure problems or embouchure injuries, this tends to actually kind of focus in on like what your embouchure really kind of ideally looks like. So what I'll do is an interim step. If again you want the mirror, I think you always want to have the mirror available whenever you're doing any kind of block buzzing work. Somewhere in this room I've got a lead pipe with a wine cork in it that makes it easier to do this, but I don't really feel like looking for it right now. So I'll just do it the old-fashioned way. All right. Got the mirror next to me. I'll use the camera for now. Now, you go through this whole octave doing this thing. It seems a little bit, you know, maybe obsessive, but the idea is that you're getting a sense. You know, sometimes when we're playing, we don't have a really good idea for what muscles are really involved with our embouchure. This is one way to do it. You don't have any of the baggage from trying to create a buzz. You don't have any of these worries about whether, you know, even the sound of the buzz. All you're doing is getting an idea for what it feels like to engage certain muscle groups. And I've seen this happen a lot where students who will sort of, as they play, they'll super proud or the chin comes up, something like that, especially as they go into the low register. This is one way that even if they do have this habit, a lot of times they go to the mouthpiece and they sort of, as an instinct, as a way that to sort of, you know, just subconsciously, you tend to engage these muscles much more efficiently. So it's one way that you can get a sense for what it might feel like if you're someone who's working with a chin that kind of comes up like this or bunches up. It's one way to get an idea for what muscles are actually involved in keeping that down. Now, like I said, in terms of what I do, I don't use this as a daily regimen anymore, but I did use it a lot when I was going through this whole embouchure change after this injury, okay? So, after that would be the mouthpiece buzz. Check my pitch again. Again, no perfect pitch. When it comes to the mouthpiece, for me, again, I've got my mirror set up right over here. I'm looking for a nice, clear sound. I don't like to think of playing any louder than like a mezzo piano, something very easy. I feel like loud mouthpiece buzzing, it can be useful for some things, but for me, in terms of really trying to get an idea for where my aperture is and where that buzz is really going to happen for me, I find it to be sort of counterproductive. So I tend to default to a much more gentle, much more sort of lighter approach to the mouthpiece, looking for just a nice, clear sound. And as I'm doing this, not only am I listening to the sound, but I'm also checking in. You know, I'm using the Facebook as the mirror. It's using the iPad as the mirror right now. But if I have an actual mirror up on my stand, I'll tend to just sort of use that to just check in, make sure there's no, you know, that kind of stuff happening with the chin bunching up, or even, as a very important thing, to notice what you're doing as you breathe every time before you engage with the mouthpiece. We can. We're so focused on production so many times that we pick up the horn that we tend to not really think about what's going on right as we prepare to play, right as we prepare the embouchure. So I do think it's important for you to, as you do this kind of thing, also just notice what's going on with your breathing. Are you doing something like pulling up, like a little, that kind of thing? There's all kinds of reflexes that we have. Thanks, Mike. I'll be waiting for that check. I could use it, right? There's all kinds of reflexes that we can that we have that will sometimes sort of creep in. So it's always good to just sort of do a check-in every morning just to make sure that these really basic mechanics are there for you, but just to sort of also keep it nice and methodical, right? So. So never take any of that for granted. You know, even the stuff right before you prepare the embouchure, don't take it for granted. Use this time as you're first getting started in the day, the time when I feel that we're most sort of attentive to this kind of stuff. Use it as a time to just make sure your mechanics are as efficient as they could be. Okay, the last step to this one, for me, is then to transfer this whole lips, mouthpiece, horn, and possible block buzzing regimen in there over to the trombone. And what we're actually doing here on the trombone, for me, is I'm doing a pitch bend of down about a half step, and I'm doing it by actually opening up the aperture. So I'm sort of imagining my teeth are coming a little bit farther apart. You know, you can bend the pitch by sort of smushing your lips into the mouthpiece, But that's not what we're looking for here. We're trying to open up the aperture past the point of being efficient and then bring it back together to the time that we first hear a great sound. It's a way to aim for playing on the low side of the pitch. It's something that Laurie Frink taught me when I was coming back from this injury stuff. And I find it very useful as a way to just sort of check in and rebalance and make sure that I'm really at the most efficient point on the buzz that I could be. How's it going, Alex? All right, so the way this goes for me. You can see I'm trying as best I can to do this by literally opening up the aperture. I'm going to take that down an entire octave, and if you're sort of curious and you want a primer on this lips, mouthpiece, horn exercise, Julie Landsman has a really excellent series of things on her website under the Caruso method section. I'm not like someone you would call a Caruso disciple. I certainly never studied with Carmine. I have worked with a few people who have. Julie is one of them. Laurie Frink was someone who is also very familiar with Carmine's work. I've always just defaulted to this one particular exercise because for me, the idea of learning the sensitivity of the aperture, it's the sort of setup of everything was really, really, really important. So check that out if you want another sort of primer. You can always go back. I will do this exact same series, starting a little higher. So the next series I would do is after I go down that whole octave F to F is getting through from that middle B flat to the low B flat. So the idea would be to do the exact same thing. I do the, because I don't have perfect pitch. And when I do this, you can sort of see in there, I'm sort of trying to aim for this area. This gives me the first clip, first idea of sort of where the aperture is. Morgan, I don't usually do the breathing through the nose. I tend to really take this as an opportunity to check through how mechanically I'm going to reassemble the embouchure every time. I know that for some Caruso exercises, you're encouraged to maintain the integrity of the embouchure, sort of as a muscle building, strength building, endurance building kind of thing. But that's not generally what I'm using this for. I'm using this more to sort of find the sensitivity of the aperture, not to create endurance, and also I think along with that aperture awareness and aperture sensitivity, there's the idea that you have to know exactly how to put your embouchure, how to prepare the embouchure for the air. So I think it's very important, at least from my perspective, to not end up and do that and keep flexed, because that's not really what I'm trying to accomplish here, especially as the first thing in the day. I'm not trying to burn out the muscle group. So hopefully that answers your question on that one. All right. So after this whole lips, mouthpiece, horn series, then I just try to get into some very basic slurring. By this point, I'm usually much more aware of where the aperture is. I feel a little bit better. I've gotten a little bit of blood flow into the muscles. They're feeling a little looser. Hopefully I'm shaking off, whatever the fatigue is from the previous night. And then I just really get into the most fundamental slurs, which to me starts on B flat F. I mean, if you have your Schlossberg book hanging around, this is pull out any of those initial exercises. done these slurs before, of course. What I'm generally thinking about when I do these is I'm just trying to make sure that I'm again, because this is such an early part of the warm up for me, is this time I'm trying to make sure that I'm blowing my air right at that fulcrum in between the two notes, right at the middle of the slur, trying to avoid any of this like that kind of thing that we've heard in various forms from some of our students. The tone zone. Thanks, Brian. The idea to really just make sure that you're feeling comfortable with the idea that the air is going to be the thing that propels you from one note to the next. That the chops are guiding the airstream, and that you don't have a sort of pulsing of the air or like a little punch to the air or something like that to get you from one note to the next. So again, because this is such an initial exercise, I feel like just as much as this is waking up the chops, this is also reminding me of how I want to handle all of my slurs and all of my flexibility later on. Okay, so I would usually go through first that very simple thing. Looking for some bolero preparation advice. Okay, so if you want to prepare a bolero, first thing you do, play it. Don't even warm up. No, we can talk about that later. So the other thing here, I like to do this not only up, down, in the middle register. I think it's also important to get used to doing it from approaching up, down, up. I know that seems like a strange thing, but I think if we get into the habit where all of our slurs are always settling for the bottom, you can kind of get into an unconscious habit of setting up a particular way for slurs. So the next thing I often do, we'll just do an octave version of this slur, starting from middle B flat and then down and then back up again. Referring to, by the way, for those of you watching the comments, and I really, because we're all a little bored and a little stir crazy right now, go to YouTube and type in "The Rhenish is fun" and see where that takes you. Okay, so that's essentially it. So at this point, I've done my lips, mouthpiece, horn. I've done a couple sets of slurs. Sometimes it'll take a little bit more time than that. But that just gives you an idea for what I feel like I need to do to then actually prepare to do long tones. Sorry. I tend to just more or less stick with the stuff that's typical. I don't know if it was originally a Remington thing. I learned it from Joe in terms of how I approach my long tones. But one thing I like about it is that if you're doing your long tones, always returning to a home key or a home note, and you're doing it in a particular key, you can sort of train yourself to hear in a key as well. You know, so I would say that if you're sort of bored with long tones and you want another way to do it, put on your tonal energy tuner, get your earbuds in, and set it to adjust intonation, put on a chord, like a B flat major chord, and see sort of how your intonation fits into that. But generally speaking, this is where I'll really start getting into the work part of my warm-up. So. When I have to breathe, I try to then repeat the note that I came from. So even while I'm doing these long tones, I'm not cheating the slur. And this is an extension of the slurring exercise that I did before. I'm always trying to make sure that the air is a constant, that I'm pushing the air right at that break in the slur, so that I'm not getting to the point where this is getting a little bit of that broken kind of slur, that I'm not relying on an extra pulse of air to create the slur or anything along those lines. And you'll notice that a lot of times I'm using either a glissando or like a quasi fall in between the notes. I'm really still, even though I'm starting to do some of the work in terms of balancing my sound, I'm really trying to make sure that I don't develop any inclination to disturb the airstream, to keep it as smooth as possible. So therefore the glissando or using some of those falls are ways that I can sort of get into that idea, and I try to remind myself. Now, I will usually take this well into the low range, down into the pedal range, so, you know, I won't sit here and go through the entire thing because it's very time-consuming, but I do think it's very important as tenor trombone players that we do every day live in this bass register. Etc. I'll go down into the pedal register. All right. Now at that point, because we're talking about trying to maintain all of our different equipment, once I've done that on the tenor trombone, I usually will kick it over to the alto. Now, a lot of times I'm not playing, alto. My job tends to be much more tenor bass with just the occasional alto trombone, but I do feel like, that's a good memory, David. It's been a long time. So at this point, I like to switch over to the alto trombone because while I'm really focusing in on the airstream, I like to feel that difference that the alto trombone will give me, and then eventually the bass trombone. You know, trying to sort of train my body to be reflexive rather than reactive to the instruments. You know, I think sometimes if you have like an exclusive alto trombone session, an exclusive bass session, and while those can be helpful, I do think it's very important early on to practice going back and forth between the two different instruments, or the three different instruments, so that you can really get used to the way that the air works and the way that the chops feel as they exist on these three different horns. So for me, I'll go to the alto trombone next, and do a series of ascending instruments, because, you know, the alto trombone tends to be a little bit higher. I'll start in the middle here. And I'll work my way up, but I'll just try to keep going up when I was, basically trying to go as high as I can. So I'll fast forward a little bit here. And with the alto, I tend to linger a little bit more on the upper notes as I get higher, because I want to give myself a chance to feel the way that the back pressure is inside the different mouthpiece. and just generally to feel the different the landscape within this mouthpiece. The aperture is always feels like it's a slightly different shape and responds slightly differently to the alto trombone. So I tend to linger a little higher, or rather, I linger a little bit more on the upper notes here. And I'll sort of work my way on up. And then once I've done the alto trombone, sort of gotten a little bit higher, usually I'll cut off around F, I switch back over to the bass, all right? And it might seem a little bit extreme, but again, this is early on in the work session. Now, if I do all of these truly as I would do them without screaming, I mean, this takes me a long time because I usually really live in these instruments. But for the bass, I sort of do a little bit of a different thing. I'll start in the middle, and I work my way down, sort of settling in on the lower notes, linger on those as opposed to the ascending notes in the alto trombone. So you just get used to how the aperture works as you're getting into this one. I'll start a little lower on the bass, but I usually start in the middle F. Yeah, you know it's end times, Matthew, when you're watching me warm up on bass trombone, right? And I take the bass trombone down, as low as I can in any given day. The upper limits of the alto trombone and the bottom limit of the bass trombone changes from day to day for me. And I'll try to take it down. So at a certain point, the idea is that you've gone through this lift mouthpiece horn thing. You've taken the time to zero in on the most fundamental aspects of your aperture and your breathing. And then you've gone through your various instruments, your alto trombone, your tenor trombone, your bass trombone. Maybe you're doing some small bore tenor, which I have behind me. If it's a euphonium week or a bass trumpet week, sometimes I'll do a little bit of playing on those. But I just want to get used to the idea that I'm not going to have to rearrange my chops completely in between everything. That each one of them is a reflex. So it's a reflexive way to learn to engage each different instrument versus a reactive way where it's like, oh God, I've got to get my alto face on, And that I think is very important, that if you're going to be going back and forth with any kind of regularity between these instruments. Now, generally, after I get on my long tones, I try to build upon this idea of keeping the air as the primary driver of everything, and I'll sort of dump that over into flexibility. And flexibility, I found, as someone who went through an embouchure injury and really lost contact of where the center of my embouchure was anymore, flexibility was something that really helped to bring it back for me. So I usually start off a little bit more simple kind of flexibility. All right, so that's sort of a more fundamental kind of flexibility thing. I'm trying to keep it light. I'm not trying to linger or grip any of the particular notes too tightly. And I'm trying to really get this idea that I'm riding the airstream. And I'll start it from there and try to expand out in terms of how far from home base I'm getting. All right, so again, because I've already spent a lot of time in slurs and that kind of thing, I generally am aiming for lightness and speed and clarity as I go through these things. And generally, also, even though I tend to, at this point in my thinking, I'm using these faster flexibility things for a particular purpose. I do think you do yourself well to start a little slower and maybe then, get faster and faster. If you want to keep it really under control, doing it with the metronome can be really helpful. Or just sort of going through a pattern where you're really sort of make yourself do an accelerando. And you'll see actually that the way that your embouchure and your aperture engage the notes changes as you get towards the faster kinds of flexibility exercises or faster kinds of patterns. I do tend to sort of live with, because I kind of have used this to really dial in sort of the aperture awareness. I try to really expand outwards on this one. Let me see, because I haven't done a full-on warm-up, but I'll show you a little bit more. I do think it's important also to have skipping intervals in here. I use Brad Edwards' Lip Slurs book a lot to find some of my more favorite exercises. One that in his book that I really like. And then I'll sort of start from that as a base point. And again, trying to use some of the idea that things are a little bit more light, a little bit, you're not really leaning into any of the notes. I'll try to even put that one into a much faster time frame. Etc. So I'll push myself through that one too to get used to the idea that you can, with some amount of speed, get across some of these notes. Now, I also use this as a way to sort of slowly bring in the aperture, and I'll use that by really going into sort of the altissimo register. The slow version of this is I can feel I haven't warmed up totally. So it's generally sort of a triplet exercise that I'll use that sort of speeding it up till I can really feel that I can engage the embouchure, sort of glide through the overtone series. I think Alessi has heard this a couple times on stage when I'm getting bored, warming up. I think I just saw him pop by there on the feed. So the idea that, based on the stuff I was talking about earlier, where you're doing some more simple flexibility, at this point I'm looking for exercises that will sort of make me slowly, but with some degree of control, go through the overtone series. And I find that this exercise for me is actually one that I stole a little bit from Chris Martin, the principal trumpet at the New York Philharmonic. He does all kinds of crazy flexibility exercises that I'm doing my best to copy. But I think this idea where even you don't have to go all the way up to F. I mean, even just going through B flat to B flat. You know. I Anything like this, again, it's a really just great way to give yourself an idea for what the aperture is doing. Keep developing that sensitivity, keep riding the airstream, and start a little bit slower and work your way up, and notice the way that you have to, as you get faster and faster and faster, become lighter and more nimble, and with the aperture, that you're not particularly grabbing any particular note as it goes by. The other thing I like to do, that I'm still working on, is I was never really great against the grain slide kind of player. And so I do like to incorporate some of these, and there's anyone can have their own version of these. There's some sort of short versions of them. And I think you can find that in Brad Edwards' book as well. The one I'm focusing on these days is sort of going up and down a fifth. So trying to get this idea where I'm still able to get the notes as they go by, but able to also keep things moving and nice and flexible. All right, so again, we've talked about some that are. I think it's important to have exercises where you're skipping intervals. I think it's important to start a little bit slower, but work up and make your flexibility stuff in your fundamental practice a really a priority. Because I feel like with the flexibility comes a lot more control and actually a lot more touch at the front of the notes. So I would say it also doesn't hurt to have some where you're having to move the slide a little bit, just to change it up so you don't get totally hamstrung by only being able to move around in a single position. Again, I go to Brad Edwards and his stuff for that, but there's a few of them. Let me see if I can remember one of these that I've been doing recently. Okay, that's it. So again, moving around between those, having some chord building exercises can really do something to make your flexibility more interesting. Now, going back to what I was talking about before with doubling, once I've spent some time with the tenor trombone doing some flexibility, I do think it's important to understand how flexibility works on your other instruments. So whether you're talking about your alto trombone or your bass trombone, they have a different feel to them. It's a different air column. There's a different response. You can't just rely on the tenor trombone to have taught you exactly how to use the airstream and how to have flexibility on these other instruments without, again, being more reflexive with the instruments as opposed to reactive. So you try to build in some of that reflex, I think, by doing these exact same or very similar exercises on your other horns. So going back to that very first flexibility exercise I was doing. And you'll find that when it comes to the alto trombone, that if you try to move exactly the same way as the tenor trombone, you're going to get yourself in trouble. It won't actually be the same thing. There's a different velocity to the air. There's a different intensity to the air that you just have to learn what the feel is. And that's why I think it's really important while you're focusing in on the flexibility on the tenor trombone, of course, to start with. Then you can go back to doing a little bit more work on the other auxiliary instruments. So for the alto trombone, again, getting to the low register, different thing. You can't treat it like the tenor trombone. And then the same thing on the bass. even though you've just done ostensibly the same notes, if you're playing them on the bass trombone, it has a very different feel. You know, and for me with the bass trombone, I struggle with the clarity in the front of the note, and so I always have to remember that I'm dealing with a different balance within the mouthpiece, and I have to make some slight adjustments in order to make it much more responsive. All right, so, hey Tony, how's it going? All right, so that would generally wrap up a flexibility session. There's usually some other things that I will do in there as well. I try to get a little bit into the altissimo register. After I suffered my embouchure injury, I lost a good portion of my very high register, and it's been, even though I was able to eventually come back and to perform well, you know, to really develop the kind of power and clarity I wanted up there has been sort of an ongoing project. And lately, I'm going to do yet another shout out to Brad Edwards here. Lately, I've been using another exercise out of his book. I think it's, what is it, getting up to the 10th partial or something like that. And this is for me like the real work area. From the E flat and the E and the F have been, especially the E and the F, is been where I've had to spend most of my attention, because they're not exactly dialed in where I'd like them. So every day when I'm warming up, I do my best, even if I'm not feeling great, to try to at least approach there. So on a day like today, you know, to be quite honest, I haven't done like full-on intense practicing since this whole shutdown thing has happened. We got 2 kids up there that my wife is mercifully looking after right now so that I can do this. But I do also spend a little bit more time in here just because this is the hardest balance for me to find. And a lot of times I'll find that when I'm not feeling great or I'm a little bit out of shape, that this part of my embouchure kind of rolls under a little bit more. So trying to maintain the integrity of the aperture becomes the struggle for me at this point. As someone who's never had like an amazing high F anyway, even before I got injured, it was there, but it wasn't like incredible. Just trying to get my way back. Right around there. If I'm feeling good, I can get up to maybe a G, and a really good day like a G sharp, but that's totally my cutoff. And an F sharp is usually okay, but it's, you know, it's there. Now, if I approach it a little bit different way, at this point I will have gotten out of the thing, I'll do a little bit of starting to get into some articulation of some power playing. It's generally a smaller part of my warm-up because I do a lot of it in the orchestra anyway, but I think it's always good to have a few scales that get you up into that range. You know, and I'll do a little bit of work up there. just to sort of test the waters. And then I get into a little bit more of the interval and articulation kinds of exercises. So I'll spend a lot of time in the Arbans. Etc., etc., etc. And then a lot of times doing a series of arpeggios that Joe taught me years ago, and I think he wrote it out in one of his warm-up methods. And I'll usually go through that. I'll usually sort of go through that method until I get to about the B flat. I forgot about E flat minor. And I usually go through that series, and at that point, I will be at the end. So that's just a little synopsis. When I go through this exercise or this regimen more completely, it takes much more time. But for those of you who watched this or will watch it a little bit later because we're all a little bit bored these days, and you have any questions, or if you think that it would be helpful for me to maybe sort of write out typically what I do in some sort of more methodical kind of way, just let me know. I've got time on my hands, so maybe we can do it. So I think that's it for now. I'm going to go upstairs and help out with the kids. I think we're getting close to lunchtime. And everyone stay safe out there, stay healthy, and maybe I'll see you back here at some other point working on something else. Any requests for things? I'm bored and looking for projects, so let me know. I'll talk to you later. Bye.